We're now continuing with our study of Soren Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments, actually my favorite book by him, and that's setting it pretty high because there's a lot of great works that he authored. You know, not just Fear and Trembling and Repetition and Either Or and Sickness unto Death, but also his early thesis, or rather dissertation, on the concept of irony, which is just brilliant. But this is actually, I would say, in some ways, the most clear and most profound of his works. And here we're actually getting into the very heart of it. We've been, in some ways, fencing around, doing some preliminary work, talking about Socrates and God as a teacher in different models, and what this would entail, talking about things like the moment versus eternity, different modes of learning about one's own error. All these sorts of things are ways in which Kierkegaard is carrying out an important contrast that takes place. But it's really here in chapter 3, and then in this appendix on the offended consciousness that I hope we can get to in this lecture, that everything is coming to an absolute crux. So you could look at it as building, and then after this, it's a lot of making sense out of things after that. And this chapter is called the Absolute Paradox of Metaphysical Crochet, so we should start out with this notion of paradox itself. That's a term that we use quite often, but I think sometimes we don't think about what it means for something to be a paradox or paradoxical. And it comes from the Greek words meaning beyond or against or alongside of para and doxa. And doxa means something, it's often translated as opinion, but it also means sort of the ordinary, commonly held belief that people have, that you can find in society, that they're working out and thinking through. So the paradox would be something that goes against our ordinary way of thinking about things, and not only our ordinary way of thinking about things as in our everyday way of thinking about things, but also our ordinary way of thinking about things as in our logical way of figuring things out, our logical way of putting things into perspective. So, what is a paradox? Well, one of the simplest paradoxes of all is called the liar's paradox. And it's, one line. I am lying to you right now. And what makes it paradoxical? Well, if it's true, then it has to be false, right? Because if it's true that I'm lying to you, then I must be making a false statement to you. Which means that, well, now again, it turns out that the statement actually is true. Because if I say I'm lying to you, and I'm making a false statement, well, then it turns out to be true. But then I can't be lying, can I? And there's a sort of circular pattern to this that I actually was fascinated by when I was an undergraduate. I wrote an entire thesis about this type of statement and actually found a way to mathematically and topographically model it using a Möbius strip. But, that's a whole different thing. Kierkegaard is after a whole different kind of paradox. A deeper paradox, not something simply having to do with the way in which we use logic, but you might say the very logic of existence, if there's a larger logic, as Hegel thought there was. So, he calls the paradox the thinker's passion, and he says that one should not think slightingly of the paradoxical, for the paradox is the source of the thinker's passion. And the thinker without a paradox is like a lover without feeling. Now, you're going to see him throughout this chapter, and really throughout this entire work, and throughout his work as a whole, making references to love, and using love as an example. So there is a paradox of self-love, transforming itself to love in the larger sense. And Kierkegaard is going to use that as a model, a way to figure out what a paradox would unfold as. So there's the paradox of self-love, and then there's the paradox of reason or thought. And we want to know, what is that leading towards? What is that transforming itself into? What is going to happen with that? So he says, the thinker without a paradox is like a lover without feeling. It's possible to be a lover, but only in a very trivial sense, not in the full sense of the term. To want to be with somebody, to desire them, but not really because you're attracted to them, or not because there's any depth of your soul that's stirred by them at their approach, but just because you want, you decided a long time ago you wanted to be with them, and you're just kind of sticking to that, and you're not even sure why. That's one way to be like that. He says, the highest pitch of every passion is always to will its own downfall. So this is very interesting, because what we have here is the deployment of what Hegel called the dialectic. And you're going to see other people in the history of philosophy also talking in these terms. Marx is taking it in a materialist direction. Kierkegaard doesn't often employ the word dialectic, but he's really a dialectical thinker. So what is the dialectical movement here that takes place with a paradox? The dialectical movement is that every passion in unfolding, in developing, inevitably wills its own downfall. Or you might say dissolution. Or perhaps it's replacement by something higher, something greater. Maybe it gives way to something else. For instance, the seed is kind of a paradoxical thing, because so long as it remains a seed down in the dirt and just tries to stick to that, it's not going to unfold and become what it ought to be, the actual plant that it's supposed to lead to. And there's a point where the seed is coming out of the husk, and you can say, well, okay, that's a seed, that's what it's supposed to do. I recognize that. It's a monocot or a dicot. You can look at the number of leaves and come to all sorts of conclusions of those sorts. But then once it's actually bursting out of the ground, and the roots are shooting down below, and the seed, shell itself has just become sort of a husk that's disappearing, it ceases to be recognizable as a seed, and it's been replaced by something, in this case, greater. So the question would be, does that happen with love? Does that happen with thought? So, he says it's the supreme passion of the reason. For Kierkegaard, this is another very important point. For Kierkegaard, our intellectual life, our rationality, is not something that is directly opposed to emotion, passion, desire, affectivity. It enfolds that. Beautiful idea. It's something that runs through many other thinkers, but you see it really carried out here in Kierkegaard. Reason has a passion. What is the passion? Well, if we go back to Aristotle, all men by nature desire to know. And what is it that wants to know in us? Is it our desire for food? Well, that wants to know, what does that taste like, and how can I eat that over there? But that's not wanting to know in the full sense. There is a drive within us, and many philosophers have pointed this out in the past, before Kierkegaard. There's a drive within us, a hunger, as Hegel actually called it, Begierde, to assimilate things to ourselves, to wrap our heads around things, to extend ourselves and our minds, our intellects, our rationality beyond where we currently are, to make sense out of things. That's a desire for us. It's a restless desire. And so reason itself, you think of reason as being this, coldly logical, detached thing. That's because the philosophers often portray it that way, but that's not the way that real philosophers actually think about things. We are passionate about thinking things out. We get passionate when we, can't make sense out of things, when we run into opposition. So he says it's the supreme passion of the reason to seek a collision, though this collision must in one way or another prove its undoing. So reason itself may be undone by this collision. The supreme paradox of all thought is the attempt to discover something that thought cannot think. So this is an important point. And I'm going to erase this now, get this out of our way. The supreme passion of thought is to find something that is totally unlike thought, that resists it, that thought itself cannot think. So, we have something now to fill in over here. The unlike, the unthinkable. And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. So he says, this is at bottom present in all thinking, even in the thinking of the individual, insofar as in thinking he participates in something transcending himself. So if we're just thinking about what we've got in front of us, this may not be occurring. But as soon as we start thinking that leads us beyond the boundaries of ourselves, engaging with reality, as soon as we start engaging with anything that transcends ourself, anything where there's a little bit of mystery, anything that we don't fully understand, even if we're thinking within ourselves about the human heart, we're participating in something transcending ourselves. But he says habit dulls our sensibilities and prevents us from perceiving it. So this is something that Kierkegaard is exposing to us, that he thinks is going on whether we realize it or not in our thinking, and most of the time we're not actually paying attention to it. So he says, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Let's think about how it comes about that we have this paradoxical thing that takes place. So he says, we know what man is, and this wisdom which I shall be the last to hold in light esteem may become progressively more richer and more significant, and with it also the truth. But now the reason stands still, just as Socrates did. For the paradoxical passion of the reason is aroused and seeks a collision. Without rightly understanding itself, it is bent on its own downfall. And now he's going to bring in love to use as an analog to make sense of this. And I think that's a brilliant move on his part for two reasons. One is that we have an easier time understanding love on the whole than we do the workings of our own mind, our rationality. They're both equally primordial part of who we are, to be rational creatures and to be loving creatures. But it's easier to make sense out of love, I think. Epistemology, when it's done right, when it's not just a sort of scholastic exercise, is something very akin to metaphysics in that it's trying to figure out what is this act of knowing? What is it for us to be thinking? What is it to try to attain certainty, to move from knowing less or being less certain to knowing more or being more certain? That's tough to think. That's tough to wrap our heads around. But we all have experience with loving, or at least I hope we all do, to some degree. So we can make better work with this, I think Kierkegaard thinks. So there's that, and then there's one other thing. Love and knowledge can be separated apart from each other. And in many people's philosophy, love and knowledge are treated almost as if they're within two separate domains, like love and the feelings are down here and knowledge is way up here. Or maybe you might switch it around so that love, is somehow beyond reason, irrational, greater than reason, and reason and the intellect are down here. Well, that's not the way that classical Christian philosophy has treated love and knowledge. If you look at Augustine, You look at thinkers going all the way up until, you know, some of the great phenomenologists of the 20th century. Love and knowledge cannot be neatly extricated from each other. They condition each other. So they do for Kierkegaard as well. So Kierkegaard talks about self-love. Self-love lies as the ground of all love, or is the ground in which all love perishes, he says. Man lives undisturbed a self-centered life until there awakens within him the paradox of self-love. What is the paradox of self-love? Well, you begin to love, to desire another. This is eros. Although it's not necessarily tied directly to sexual satisfaction or something like that, but it's a desire for what you don't have for you. So you want that thing out there because you actually do love yourself enough to want that good thing for you. Once that starts kicking in, and you begin to love the other, you can do this with, you know, chocolate, and it's not going to have this kind of dialectical progression, right? Chocolate is not going to love you back. Chocolate is not going to look into your eyes and try to figure out who you are and try to learn about your soul or awaken desires in you. Neither will an animal, but a human being can evoke within us something that begins to pull us outside of ourselves. So we begin with self-love, desiring the other, and desiring the other for our own sake. And then as we get to know the other more, we come to appreciate the other, we come to love the other in a different way. And that requires us, at a certain point, we become conscious of this, that we cannot simply indulge our own self-love and use the other almost like a commodity. That sooner or later there come points in time where we have to choose between our own desires and the satisfaction of those desires and the good of the other, who has other desires, who is another self, who is just as real as us, and perhaps as valuable or even more valuable than we are. So self-love, paradoxically, ends up leading to something that goes against self-love. This is the dialectical progression. That's why Kierkegaard brings this up. He wants to say that within self-love there's the seeds of its own destruction. So he says, the lover is so completely transformed by the paradox of love, he scarcely recognizes himself. That paradox transforms us. The paradox takes place not just out there in the world, but within us. In like manner, the paradoxical passion of the reason, while as yet a mere presentiment, retroactively affects man in his self-knowledge, so that he who thought to know himself is no longer certain about what he is. What is it then that reason collides with? And notice, he's not just talking about reason in relation to the other person, the world. He's talking about trying to know oneself. And human beings are somewhat of a mystery to themselves. The human heart is not perfectly transparent. Descartes was to some degree wrong in thinking that our thought is transparent to itself, that we can sort of, take our stand on this, luminosity of the cogito. Instead, we try to explore what we are, and we find all sorts of pockets of things that are tough to make sense of within ourselves. So he says, what is this unknown something with which the reason collides when inspired by its paradoxical passion, with the result of unsettling even man's knowledge of himself? It is, instead of just the unlike or the unthinkable, the unknown. It is not a human being insofar as we know what man is, nor is it any other known thing, some thing of the universe, a book, a coffee cup, a chalkboard, an environment, or something like that. So we're going to call this unknown God. He says, the God. It is nothing more than a name we assign to it. The idea of demonstrating that this unknown something exists could scarcely suggest itself to the reason. And now he's going to switch things up a bit. He's going to go into a long digression about arguments or proofs for God's existence. So let's clear a little space, and while we're doing that, think about what's going on in this passage. Why does he make that transition? Well, how does the intellect, or if you think about it in more personal terms, how does the person who is driven by their life of the mind, by the desire of reason, by the intellect to get to know things, how do they proceed? They don't just sort of take things on faith or jump into the first well that presents itself, or a cart, or pick whatever you like. They want to think about it. They want to prove it. They want to have reasons given for them. So, one of the classical discussions that's still going on today in philosophy has to do with arguments or proofs for God's existence. And if you take an intro to philosophy class, or you take a philosophy of religion class, you're going to come across, a number of them, and oftentimes they get, put into, certain basic categories: the ontological arguments, teleological arguments, cosmological arguments, Pascal's wager, or pragmatic arguments, moral arguments. There's a lot more, I think, to it than they actually bring out. Some of these don't fit quite so well. For instance, Anselm's argument is not an ontological argument in the sense that Kant made of it. But there is a sort of common drive, this idea that you're going to prove that God exists, and then you're going to use that to make sense out of other things. So, what does Kierkegaard say? He says, this wouldn't suggest itself to the reason that's sort of groping in the dark trying to figure out this paradox. For if the God does not exist, it would of course be impossible to prove it. And if he does exist, it would be a folly to attempt it. For at the very outset in beginning my proof, I would have presupposed it, not as doubtful, but as certain. And, if you look at some of the classical texts in which there are arguments for God's existence given, that's exactly what happens. Anselm's Proslogion starts out with Anselm praying to God, and then says, hey, let me think about some things having to do with you. Oh, I see that you necessarily exist. That even though that the fool says in his heart there is no God, if the fool really thought things through, the fool would see that there has to be God, and that God has to have these attributes and that sort of thing. He's saying that in a prayer to God. He's never put it into doubt himself. Thomas Aquinas, in providing arguments that are supposed to maybe convince unbelievers or help people solidify their resolution, he's not like abandoning his faith and putting it into the balance and then saying, if I can't prove this, it's all gone. They're beginning from that position already. So he says, this is what Kierkegaard says, generally speaking, it's a difficult matter to prove that anything exists. What's still worse for the intrepid souls who undertake the venture, the difficulty is such that fame scarcely awaits who concern themselves with it. The entire demonstration always turns into something very different and becomes an additional development of the consequences that flow from having assumed that the object in question exists. I always reason from existence, not towards existence. So there's two ways we can go. And Kierkegaard says only the top one actually works. The bottom one is what seems to be going on in a lot of arguments for God's existence, but it doesn't really get off the ground. So he says, whether I move in the sphere of palpable sensible fact or in the realm of thought, I don't, for example, prove that a stone exists, but that some existing thing, started with something that exists, is a stone, what it's like. The procedure in a court of justice does not prove that a criminal exists, but that the accused whose existence is given is a criminal. Whether we call existence an accessorium or the eternal prius, something that's given beforehand, it's not subject to demonstration. So he says, let's take ample time for consideration. And that's some good advice, actually. You don't want to hurry through Kierkegaard any more than you want to hurry through any great philosopher. You want to linger over these thoughts until they actually get their foothold, you might say. So he says, we don't have any reason for haste as those who, from concern for themselves or for the God or some other thing, must make haste to get existence demonstrated. And you can think about some people doing apologetics, trying to argue for, say, the existence of God or what God is like. They often do seem like they're in a hurry. And I think that the people who do apologetics best are the ones who are not explicitly engaged in apologetics, but are thinking along with people, are not trying to make everything into one tight, systematic way of viewing things or argument or anything like that and to provide to everybody else, but are actually lingering there with other people in their doubts, in their reflections, their speculations that come up, putting things together bit by bit. That takes a certain kind of trust. So he says, let's take Napoleon, for example. If we were going to try to prove Napoleon's existence from Napoleon's deeds, so we're going to start out with what Napoleon is like and then argue to the existence of Napoleon. You might think, for example, of doing this with Sherlock Holmes. Everyone knows what Sherlock Holmes is supposed to be like. He's got that hat and the pipe, and he's kind of tall and very smart. Although, the new movies have kind of, skewed things a little bit and made him a little bit more athletic and action hero-y than he used to be. But does that mean that Sherlock Holmes exists? Because we've come up with some attributes. No, he's a fictional character. What about Napoleon? Could you just come up with a bunch of attributes of Napoleon and then conclude that he exists? He says, no, you have to assume that Napoleon exists first, and then you can start worrying about what this guy is like. Short, warlike, charismatic, all those sorts of things. So, what about God? He says, between the God and his works, there's an absolute relationship. God is not a name, but a concept. Is this perhaps the reason that his essentia involvit existentiam? So essence involves or implies existence, as Spinoza wanted to say. Kierkegaard is rejecting that. He says, the works of God are such that only the God can perform them. Okay, so now we're actually looking at something like a cosmological argument. We see certain things in the world and we say, there's great order, everything got going. Order is teleological, of course, I know, but just go with me for this. There's some sort of metaphysical processes going on. You need something big to get that going. So we're going to say, well, that would be God. Well, the works from which I would deduce his existence, Kierkegaard says, are not directly and immediately given. The wisdom in nature, the goodness, the wisdom in the governance of the world, are these manifest on the face of things? Does everybody sees that? Or are we not here confronted with the most terrible temptations to doubt? And is it not impossible finally to dispose of all these doubts? Well, that seems to be the case. I mean, not everybody buys by looking around at the universe that we're in that, wow, there must be a God. And even believers sometimes doubt that sort of thing, particularly when life gets tough, when things don't turn out the way that they're supposed to. It says, from such an order of things, I'll not attempt to prove God's existence. Even if I began, I'd never finish. Why? Well, because I have to engage in interpretation in order to make this work. An ideal interpretation, he says, meaning not a real, concrete thing, but sort of, putting my not necessarily blinders, but at least filters onto it. Perhaps rather than reading into exegesis, the book of the world, no, exegesis, sorry, rather than reading out of the book of the world things that are there, actually sort of projecting it in, eisegesis, into the book of the world. So he says, how does God's existence emerge from the proof? Let's say you even did this sort of thing. How does it actually work with philosophical proofs? Does it follow straight away without any breach of continuity? Or do we have an analogy to these little Cartesian dolls he talks about? As soon as I let the doll go, it stands on his head. So we would call these weebles. You know, remember the weebles wobble but they don't fall down? So too with the proof. As long as I keep my hold on the proof, you know, I'm bending it down, continue to demonstrate the existence does not come out for no other reason than I'm engaged in proving it. When I let the proof go, poof, the existence is there. But this act of letting go is surely something, he says. It's a contribution of mine. This is a big problem. The idea is that reason would see that this leads inevitably, without any contribution on the reasoning person's part, from here to here. But really what's required is some sort of leap, Kierkegaard says. Some sort of contribution. He says, this little moment, brief as it may be, it need not be long, it is a leap. I'm taking a leap. I'm making the proof actually work. Now, if that's the case, well then, reason and rationality are not exactly what we thought they were. And if you start admitting stuff like that, doesn't it get a little dangerous? Not just with, you know, arguments about God, but about other things. So, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So he says, whoever therefore attempts to demonstrate the existence of God, except in the sense of clarifying the concept, you know, starting from existence and then making sense out of what it is that exists, proves in lieu thereof something else, something which at times perhaps does not need a proof, and in any case needs none better. So what is he talking about there? What is often called the God of the philosophers. You might be able to prove that there's some sort of unmoved mover or uncreated cause, you know, or, you know, a necessary cause or you know, necessary being or something like that. But is that what we in fact call God? Thomas Aquinas, you know, concludes his famous proofs by, and all men call this God. But, you know, again, there's that leap there, isn't there? Because Kierkegaard and a lot of other people could come along and say, that isn't what I call God. What are you talking about? Unmoved mover. Well, yeah, I guess that's an attribute of God, perhaps, but that isn't what I'm thinking of when I'm talking about God. So that's a real problem. So he says, if in the moment of beginning his proof it's not absolutely undetermined whether the God exists or not, he doesn't prove it. And if it's thus undetermined from the beginning, he will never come to begin. Why not? Well, you know, partly from, he says, fear of failure, since the God perhaps does not exist, partly because he's got nothing to begin with. We have to begin, Kierkegaard says, with existence, with something that we actually have, something that's present, or at least present as an absence, you might say. So, the paradoxical passion of the reason, like he says, thus comes repeatedly into collision with this unknown, which does indeed exist, but is unknown. So we took a detour through these discussion about arguments for God's existence, and we didn't actually come up with anything positive, but something was taken away. A path was closed that we did need closed off, Kierkegaard would say. And so we actually did make some sort of progress. Now we're going to try to make progress in a somewhat different direction. So let's start again. Reason has a passion, and that passion is to will its own downfall, and this is the unknown, and that unknown is the God, about which we don't really know that much, as it turns out. Reason comes into collision with this unknown, which does indeed exist, but is unknown, and insofar it does not exist, reason cannot advance beyond this point. So reason finds itself, you might say, in a trap of its own making. It cannot advance beyond this point, and yet it cannot refrain in its paradoxicalness from arriving at this limit. There's a limit here. And from occupying itself therewith. So reason started out over here. Oops. And it was led by its own passion to extend itself up to something that now it's not able to assimilate. It starts realizing its own limits, its own inability to even grasp its own limits entirely, to figure out what's on the other side. And now it says it can't dismiss its relation to it simply by asserting the unknown does not exist. And this is one thing that some philosophers, one strategy that philosophers have attempted to take. Those of a positivistic bent who say, look, if it can't be known by reason, not necessarily by pure reason, deducing things off in its corner, but by a human approach to experience, to thinking, to making sense out of things. If it can't be thoroughly made sense out of by those means, then it has no value, no existence. It's purely imaginary. It's just sort of a phantom of reason, you might say. You see some people like, for instance, David Hume saying things along those lines. Even Immanuel Kant, although he has sort of a restricted area for things that can only be thought but can't be understood. But they're very small. It's a very small group of things that fit in there. They seem to exemplify that sort of attitude. So does the coarse-minded positivist who says, everything that you're talking about is metaphysics and mysticism. Well, the proper response to that is, well, yeah, we do metaphysics and mysticism because there's other stuff besides what has been thought of in your reasoning. Or, quote the old line from Hamlet, there's more on heaven and earth than is thought of in your philosophy. So reason cannot just dismiss its relation to the unknown because this involves a relationship itself. And reason is always going to be kind of gnawed at, kind of plagued by that. The reason can choose to do that. The reasoning person can say, I'm not going to think about that stuff. But then, in the dark hours, when they cease distracting themselves, those sorts of things will come back to haunt them. So then, what is this unknown? Since the designation of it as the God merely signifies for it that it's unknown. To say that it is the unknown because it can't be known, and even if it were capable of being known, it could not be expressed, does not satisfy the demands of passion. So you can't get out of it just by saying, well, look, it's the unknown. Unknown is unknown, right? That's a tautology. And reason may say, well, okay, I'll grant you that I can't fully understand this. Tell me why. I want to understand that, at least. I want to wrap my head around why this is such a problem for me and why I can't stop thinking about this. So, like he says, it becomes a torment for passion, although it also serves as an excitement. And yet the reason can come no further. So what then is this unknown? It is the limit, again, the limit to which reason repeatedly comes, and insofar substituting a static form of conception for the dynamic is the different, the absolutely different. What does he mean by substituting a static form for a dynamic? Well, when we're actually thinking concretely as human beings, we are in process, we are dynamic, we are engaged in an activity where things change over time. We assimilate things, we reject things, insofar as we can represent it to ourselves. Maybe say, put it into a textbook or a philosophical system. it becomes static. It has to stay in place. Stasis means staying in place, among other things. So when we do that, we turn this into the absolutely different. Because it is absolutely different, there's no mark by which it could be distinguished. When qualified as absolutely different, it seems on the verge of disclosure. It seems like by saying that it's the absolutely different, we're actually getting our head around it and figuring out, well, what is this thing? And now a dialectical progression takes place. That Kierkegaard, again, doesn't call a dialectical progression. And I see sort of 5 stages in this. So we're going to go through these now. Reason cannot conceive an absolute unlikeness. Reason is unable to figure out what would it be for something to be so radically different that you can't even attribute the word different to it. It cannot negate itself absolutely, but uses itself for that purpose. So reason, secretly, is forming a conception here. It's using itself, and it thus conceives only such an unlikeness within itself as it can conceive by means of itself. So the difference is reflected into reason. We can call this the idea or the conception of difference, which is not the same thing as the absolutely different. Reason cannot negate itself absolutely. It uses itself for the purpose. Now, it cannot absolutely transcend itself, and hence conceives only such a superiority over itself as it can conceive by means of itself. There's a lot of selves in there. Let's run through what this actually means. This is the second stage. So reason is coming up with this idea, and that's part of reason's own province, right? And it's using this idea of difference as a way to transcend itself. It's generating a superiority over itself within itself. So reason is kind of splitting within itself, as if there's a higher reason that grasps this difference and the fact that it is difference, and then a lower reason. Well, this is very similar to what Hegel and Kant and other German idealists were actually talking about. Kierkegaard is going through a kind of similar process here, without bringing anybody up. You have to read between the lines a little bit. So, he says, unless the unknown remains a mere limiting conception, here's where the third important movement is going to take place. The single idea of difference will be thrown into a state of confusion. And now, there will be a number of different ideas of the different or of difference, of many differences. The unknown is then in a condition of dispersion, and the reason may choose at pleasure. Reason gets to decide, well, I think I like this one, or I think I like this one, or I like this one. And the imagination may suggest the monstrous, the ludicrous, etc. Now, that sounds okay. Well, you just sort of pick one of these, and now it's going to make sense. And Kierkegaard actually ties this in with some ideas of what took place in the development of religions, and even within heretical movements within the Christian religion. And he says, this isn't going to work though. So now we get to the fourth dialectical movement. It's impossible to hold fast to a difference of this nature. Every time it's done, every time that reason picks one of these, it realizes that it's an arbitrary act. Deepest down in the heart of piety lurks the mad caprice which knows that it itself has produced the God. Reason ends up saying, well, I'll pick this absolutely different, and we'll call it the Logos, and we'll conceive of it in this way and not in that way, or we'll call it Zeus, or we'll call it this, or we'll call it the, Pleroma, or pick whatever you like. And deep inside of its heart, because reason does have a heart, it realizes, I'm kind of manufacturing this myself. It wants to have a relation to this, but it's really doing something within itself. So it says, if no specific determination of difference can be held fast because there's no distinguishing mark, like and unlike finally become identified with each other, And here he actually talks about dialectical opposites. If this is arbitrary, then this is arbitrary, then this is arbitrary, why pick any of them? Now we're back almost to square one. But we're not actually back to square one. He says, the unlikeness clings to the reason and confounds it, so that the reason, this is very important, this is the fifth dialectical movement. The reason no longer knows itself and quite consistently confuses itself with the unlikeness. As for this last named supposition, the self-irony of the reason, he says, I shall attempt to delineate it merely by a stroke or two without raising any question of its being historical. And now he tells something that's almost like a parable, except that you can recognize it as one of the central doctrines of Christianity. There exists an individual whose appearance is precisely like that of other men. And he goes through a bunch of ways in which this is the case. He says, this man is also the God. How do I know? I cannot know it, for in order to know it, I would have to know the God. If I were just reason trying to figure this sort of stuff out, reason by itself could never deduce the God-man, could never realize that that had to be the case. It can only make sense of it afterwards, right? So it says, I cannot know it, for in order to know it, I would have to know the God and the nature of the difference between the God and man. And this I cannot know, because reason has reduced it to likeness with that from which it was unlike. And then thus the God becomes the most terrible of deceivers, because the reason has deceived itself. Reason has brought the God as close as possible, and yet he is as far away as ever. So, we've made three movements so far. We've looked at reason and the paradox. That reason necessarily, because it is also a passion, brings about its own disillusion or its own limit, its own destruction, because it's driven to know what it can't know, to eclipse itself, to transcend itself. That was the first movement. The second movement was this digression about proofs for God's existence, and we realized that as far as Kierkegaard is concerned, you're not going to solve these problems about figuring out things by God just by having reason kind of project things out of itself, or looking at the world and making sense out of those, or just using some idea like, the idea of perfection and coming to understand it that way. The third movement was this dialectical progression where reason now realizes that it's grappling with what is fundamentally different from itself, what it can't fully grasp, what it can't even grasp, whether it grasps well or not, and then tries to make sense of that, but only within its own scope, generating ideas within itself, and then finally sort of, realizing, wow, I have spent a lot of time spinning stuff out of myself, and I'm no closer to understanding the unknown, the God, that which I'm not able to think, than I was before. So, does that mean that we have to say, well, game is done. Reason did its best. We should all just be skeptics or agnostics and just concentrate on what we do know. Take a positivist or a pragmatist sort of stance. Kierkegaard says no. Why? He says, reason, in attempting to determine the unknown as the unlike, goes astray and confounds the unlike with the like. From there, it would seem to follow the further consequence. What's the further consequence? Now we're in the fourth major movement in this chapter. If man is to receive any true knowledge about the unknown, he must be made to know that it is unlike him, absolutely unlike him. Reason tried to understand this unlikeness, this difference. It made a complete mess of it. It muddled it all up. It didn't achieve anything. This knowledge the reason cannot possibly obtain of itself. This would be a self-contradiction. does that mean that we have an aporia here? The way is closed off? Well, not necessarily. What if the God gives something to reason? Now, reason can't predict this. Reason can't require it. Reason can't make this happen. But if the God should so choose that to give knowledge to the reasoning human being, then what is reason going to do with it? You know, there's an initial problem. Even if it obtains such knowledge, it cannot understand it, and that it is quite unable to possess such knowledge. For how should the reason be able to understand what is absolutely different from itself? Well, again, he says, here we're confronted with a paradox. Merely to obtain the knowledge that the God is unlike him, man needs the help of the God. Call this help, or you can call it grace, right? How could the reason be expected to understand this? How can reason now, in return, make a counter-movement and understand this? Here we seem to be confronted with a paradox. Merely to obtain the knowledge that God is unlike him, man needs the help of the God. Now he learns that the God is absolutely different from himself. But if the God and man are absolutely different, this cannot be accounted for on the basis of what man derives from the God, for insofar they're akin. Their unlikeness must be derived by what man derives from himself, or what he has brought upon his own head. What is this? Well, this is the category of error, or sin, or as he's going to explore in the Acoustic Illusion, this appendix, offense, taking offense at things. What is it that the human being actually lacked in trying to make sense of this? What is God actually providing here? He is providing the human being with an understanding of what it means to be a human being, not all by itself, but in relation to something greater than itself that it at the same time is jarring with, doesn't mesh with. An understanding of the human creaturely condition, not just the human condition, but the human creaturely condition. What it is to be something less than the fullness of being itself. So he says, what did he lack? The consciousness of sin, which he indeed could no more teach to another than another could teach it to him, but only the God, if the God consents to become a teacher. But this was his purpose as we have imagined it. In order to become man's teacher, the God proposed to make himself like the individual man so that he might understand him more fully. So this, what's going on here, is not just help or grace. What's going on here is something that we call an act, the act of the incarnation. God becoming human and yet remaining God. So our paradox, Kierkegaard says, is rendered even more appalling, or the same paradox has the double aspect which proclaims that the absolute paradox, which was the title of this chapter, the absolute paradox, negatively by revealing the absolute unlikeness of sin, positively by proposing to do away with the absolute unlikeness and absolute likeness. So let's do a little bit more erasing now. We've got a lot on the board. Matter of fact, let's just clear it all out so we can make sense of where we are now. We have human being who is reason, also driven by passion. We have the unknown, also known as God, who is radically different from human beings, even different insofar as God is rational. It's a fuller, different conception of rationality than human beings. So, what has God given? The human being has sort of, had these ineffectual reaching out, trying to make sense out of things, but has failed. God provides understanding of the fact, not just the nature, but the fact of sin. And what is God providing there? He's actually providing something negative. We tend to think of a sin as sort of like a positive act, but really a sin is a privation. It's a going astray. It's a deprivation of something that ought to be there. If you talk about disorder, the components of something that's disorderly are existing. They are real. They do exist in a certain configuration. But that lacking order, it's only present there as a privation. And God allows to us an understanding of this negativity within ourselves. Part of the reason why we're separated from God, why we're not able to adequately make sense of God as we ought to, according to Kierkegaard, is coming because of this fact of sin. He's also doing something else. He's restoring to us a kind of likeness. And that's a gift as well. God doesn't have to give that. And that's not what philosophy is about, and that's not what the human condition is about. And then the person who said, well, okay, this is what God revealed to you, can say, you're not getting it. You're too wrapped up in your own view of what can fit into the confines of reason. The goal is actually to sort of expand reason, to take in what's actually being provided to it. So he says, reason in its paradoxical passion precisely desires its own downfall. But this is also what the paradox desires. And they are at bottom linked in understanding. But this understanding is present only in the moment of passion. So reason wants to make sense out of what and this is over here, the paradox is giving to it. And it's only understanding this through passion itself. And he says, consider the analogy presented by love. Self-love lies as the ground of love. We see this metaphor again. But the paradoxical passion of self-love, when at its highest pitch, wills precisely its own downfall. This is also what love desires, so that the two are linked in mutual understanding in the passion of the moment. And this passion itself is love. So if we think in terms of the self-love and the love itself, self-love wills its own downfall, which ends up being in love, and love loves so much, you might say, that it even loves the self-love and reconstitutes that with in a relation to it. So he says, why should not the lover find this conceivable? But he who in self-love shrinks from the touch of love can neither understand it nor summon the courage to venture it, since it means his downfall. Such is the passion of love. Self-love is indeed submerged, but not annihilated. It is taken captive and becomes love's spolia optima, but may again come to life. And this is love's temptation. So also with the paradox in relation to the reason. If we want to think of how we're ending this, and getting away from these very abstract terms, God, in giving this knowledge to the human being who possesses reason to try to make sense of, to try to understand, to try to respond to, God does not take away rationality in the process, does not blot it out, does not say, okay, just shut up and believe. do what I say, turn your brain off. It's really the opposite. God is trying to provoke reason to go beyond its own self-imposed, self-centered, self-blinding limitations that it has placed upon itself, in part through its own condition of sin and offense that it has taken to the very gift of the paradox giving itself, God giving itself through likeness, through knowledge, through grace to human beings. So this is a very different conception of reasoning, of rationality that is being hinted at here. Not really worked out fully, but hinted at. And with Kierkegaard, I don't think you're ever going to fully see him go as far in this direction as I would like to see him go. As people like, say, Gabriel Marcel or Maurice Blondel, Dietrich von Hildenbrand went when they dealt with these sorts of topics. But, you know, this is where he leaves off. Now we're going to have to talk about this acoustic illusion of the offended consciousness, but I'll leave that for the next video.